Bloodborne has a unique jump mechanic to say the least. Unlike other action RPGs, Bloodborne doesn't have a single input command for jumping. Instead, the player must hit the dodge button while running. Now this can be seen as a way of preventing the player from accidentally performing the wrong action since it doesn't share the same button with other actions. However, this does provide new issues since the input is more complex. The player can only jump once they are running at full velocity, otherwise they simply roll. This prevents the player from performing a simple vertical jump, as well as locking them into the jump after the input, preventing them from changing directions until after they land. This also makes the jump distance very consistent each time it's performed. At the start of the jump, the player moves about 113 centimeters in about 13 frames to reach the jump's apex. Afterwards, the player will land after moving about another 113 centimeters within the 8 frames, making the jump distance about 225 centimeters in 21 frames. Finally, after landing, the player will roll an additional 90 centimeters in 9 frames, totaling the distance to around 315 centimeters in around 30 frames. This compared to the dodge covers more distance in less frames since the dodge covers about 203 centimeters within around 26 frames. In terms of stamina consumption and fall damage, both seem to be even and change very little to nothing compared to if the player simply walks off. But due to the fact that the player has to run before jumping, they have to consume more stamina to perform a jump, even though the player does regain some stamina for about 6 frames between the input and the jump. Overall, although it is a little awkward to jump, it does seem to provide more compared to the dodge. However, Bloodborne is a combat-centric game. The dodge's simpler input allows the player to react better to an oncoming attack. The smaller frames and distance also allows the player to recover and counter fairly quickly. Also, the player is not invincible in the air during the jump. This makes the dodge much more reliable in combat than the jump feature. Also, the designs of each level seem to go out of its way to minimize the usage of the jump feature, such as adding ramps in that the player can easily jump over, or colliders over gaps and fences that block the player off from areas they can already access. This was probably done to prevent the player from being accidentally hooked on some sort of awkward piece of geometry and having to reload the game afterwards. But even the game's platforming sections do this. Half of the platforming puzzle is finding the correct entry point. The other half is mostly comprised of just the player descending. This also makes rolling a better option due to the fact that if the player completes the roll before landing, their landings become much more precise since they don't continue to move after landing. The only reason I can think of the player to roll after landing is to minimize the chance of the player accidentally landing on the very edge and sliding off afterwards. The very few sections of the game that does rely on the jumping mechanic feels tacked on and unnecessary. The player can go through most of the sections of the game without ever having to jump. Overall, I believe the game's jump feature to be more or less an aesthetic addition to the game. It's meant to give the players an additional feeling of freedom. Games that don't have a jump feature tend to feel much more restrictive, especially if they are action oriented.